Now let's look at some arts and crafts and Art Nouveau motifs. Of course, we always deal with this, and there's certain common forms that we'll see between both, and there's certain forms that will really identify a piece as either arts and crafts or Art Nouveau. Common to both, we see a look at pre-industrial culture. Now, this is not necessarily using all of the form. It's always going to be a modification. So from the arts and crafts from Art Nouveau, for example, what we're seeing is, for example, prints like this, looking back at this romantic vision of what the medieval was. Of course, as I've said before, this is where we get a lot of those romantic ideas of what medieval life was like, and so it's reflected in the pieces that they create. We also see, for example, from arts and crafts, the use of Islamic design. Of course, the medieval and Islam are going to be both heavily influential on these two forms. And here we see these three-dimensional ceiling tiles. It should remind you of the Maquarna tiles that we saw at the Alhambra in that chapter. We also see sort of a take on the mosque lamp being used, as well as some three-dimensional tile work, playing off of the ideas, but modernizing it and adjusting it for what they see as the modern aesthetic or modern taste. Now, let's deal with some arts and crafts motifs. And these are generalizations. There are times where things will cross over from one to the other. We will often see foliage. Now, in arts and crafts, the foliage is often going to be very naturalistic. They aren't stylizing it too much. It looks very realistic given the material that they're working with. And you always have to have that caveat at this period. It's always determined, the realism is determined often by what they're using. For example, a textured wallpaper might not have quite the sense of reality, but it's not necessarily stylized either. So here we see a textile showing foliage, and you see that it is simplified to a degree, but they haven't altered it. You can read it as realistic foliage. We will see a lot of Japanese-inspired design, and this is going to happen in both. In arts and crafts, we see it a lot in architecture and in furniture design. We're going to see that a lot in the United States, whereas Japanese designs become very influential on Art Nouveau, primarily in Europe. But, of course, these cross lines all the time. And when you look at it closely, you can see the inspiration, but you can also see where they've gotten away from the Japanese original. Celtic knotwork will be really common amongst English and Scottish arts and crafts. They're getting that from the Glasgow school. It had become popular a little bit prior to that. It's associated in England, Scotland, Ireland with the medieval, so there's that connection. And they're going to usually simplify it. So you're not going to see massive panels of Celtic knotwork, but you will see pieces with small elements of Celtic ornamentation tied in, usually without the Christian symbolism that's going to be associated with it when we were back in the medieval. We will also see a lot of zoomorphic forms, in other words, animal forms, although in arts and crafts when they do it, it's frequently very realistic. So here we have a dragonfly that from a distance looks like a dragonfly until you get up close and you see the sort of dragon claws and, of course, the nude half woman coming out of the top of it. And it tends to be fairly naturalistic, fairly realistic in its depiction of the natural world. So here, obviously, for example, the Acanthus in the background, these Acanthus forms are going to be, those are stylized. Obviously, leaves like that don't exist sitting around on the ground, but here the animals are very naturalistic, very realistic. Now, in terms of Art Nouveau, we tend to see more stylization, although many of the same influences. So we're going to see, for example, the Femme-Fleur. We see a lot of prints of women during this period. It's very, very common. Here we see one collection. This is looking at the months of the year. But what they're doing is they're trying to connect the natural world with what they see as the graceful lines of the female form. And oftentimes, sometimes they're nude, sometimes they're clothed. Usually there's a flowing element to it, especially in the clothing. And let me point out that we're in Europe, and here we have what appears to be an Asian woman depicted, or a woman with some Asian features depicted as one of the months. So it's kind of an interesting shift. We're seeing that hybridization, the Eastern influence coming in to Europe. We will see stylized flora and fauna. Now, this isn't always perfect, but here we see a sense of stylization. For example, reeds do not grow perfectly symmetrically all the time, but we have some naturalistic elements here. The swans have been simplified. Their wings, of course, they've drawn out all of these feathers in the wings and in the tail, whereas they used a more naturalistic approach to the feathers on the body. So it is a mix, but we tend to see more stylization of nature in the Art Nouveau. We see the use of acanthus, and this happens in both. Now, this is an example of Morris wallpaper, which is arguably primarily arts and crafts, but what you get a sense of is acanthus as these massive leaves flowing over the surface. Oftentimes, what you see is something as is depicted, where you get a sea of acanthus, this overwhelming sense of acanthus, as if you can walk on it or put your hand right through it, creating a bush in the wallpaper. It's drawing nature into the interior space, and that's primarily what they're using it for, drawing from, of course, the ancient world where we had first seen the use of acanthus. And in the Art Nouveau, and this is one of those characteristics that doesn't come over to arts and crafts that much, we're going to see the use of the whiplash line. And what I'm referring to are these lines that come around and they double back on one another quite a bit. They almost whip back and forth. And what they do from an aesthetic perspective is they draw your eye through the piece. As you look closer, you'll notice that they're very asymmetrical. They are not repeating, but it is very well balanced, by which I mean, when you look at a composition, things do not have to be symmetrical. Think of this as being on some kind of a balance. So we've got our balance here, like Lady Justice is frequently shown holding. This is probably a poor drawing of one, but it will give you the sense of it. And if I kind of cut the piece down the middle, then what should happen is the left side should roughly balance when I pile up all those pieces with the right side. Even if there's smaller pieces on one side and a larger piece on the other, it can create a sense of balance despite the asymmetry. This is a key issue. It's something that we haven't seen a lot of. We saw it during the Rococo to some degree, but it's going to become a lot more obvious in Art Nouveau, and it's something that will follow us into the contemporary world.